All right, guys, another episode of Coach's Corner. With me, we have Paul, as always, and then we have special guest, Dr. Samuel Buckner from USF. Thanks for coming on the show, Professor.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No, of course, of course. One of the things we were covering the last couple of weeks was the idea of, mechanisms of strength and hypertrophy, and mostly our audience, just to give you an idea, is going to be relatively strength athletes and coaches of strength athletes. Um, we have ventured out a little bit into more of bodybuilding and hypertrophy, but the basis is strength. And taking your strength and conditioning course last semester really brought out a lot of great questions on strength and mechanisms of strength and like what should be valued and what shouldn't be valued. And it would just thought you'd be a great person to have on to give some viewpoints that a lot of people may miss when reading through the science, because like you've talked about in your lectures and stuff, that once some of this ideology gets put in place, it gets very hard to look at it from a creative lens and kind of see some of the gaps that are in it. I was just at the ISSN conference in St. Pete, and Dr. Mike Roberts was there talking about muscle hypertrophy and some of the out of the box ideas of maybe, working on mitochondrial density and doing some things like that and being able to stretch out the fascia and things like that to create more space, right? Some really creative thoughts. And I made me think of you when he was doing that, kind of that outside the box thinking. So I thought it'd be great to have you on to give some insight onto some of the research that you just published when it comes to that, and just your ideas and kind of your theories behind it.
Yeah, right on. I think it is a pretty interesting time to be doing what I do, studying muscle growth adaptations and strength adaptations. And I do think we are at a time where I feel at least that I know less now than I knew back when I was an undergrad, right? Because back when I was an undergrad, I was told this explains how we get stronger. And the deeper I've kind of dug into it, the less I'm confident about. And I think a lot of people in the field currently would perhaps take that stance of this is what we think is happening, but we don't have really strong confidence. We have a general idea, and people are really good at getting strong, but we're still teasing out the exact mechanisms. And I think with regard to what you said, we talked about a lot of kind of emerging discussions that are being had around strength, and the way science works, or what has been my experience, is it's probably a 10-year delay before that's in a textbook, right?
Right.
Because a textbook probably takes several, I've never written a textbook, but I imagine it takes several years to write that textbook. And by the time the textbook is written, not even published, it's already outdated.
Yeah.
So there's the process of writing, and then there's also the process of changing people's minds. And the process of changing people's minds, that's the part I think that is most difficult, because when you've been taught something and you've believed it for years, and then someone new comes along and says, "Hey, I'm not sure about that," you're met with a pretty great resistance. And I suppose, I'm sure you guys want to talk about it, but the one that is most controversial right now is the idea that potentially muscle growth is not playing a large role in strength adaptation. Um, that's obviously the kind of where tend to lean, I think, at the moment. Um, and we've written on that and been doing work around that area. And when you induce growth, you can never guarantee strength, right? So you take a group of people, you make them as big as you can get them. That doesn't guarantee that they're going to get stronger. Um, and it's so intuitive that making your muscles large is going to make you strong, that that one's a tough sell. But I think when you break down everything that could potentially contribute to strength, it becomes a little bit more convincing that, okay, growth might be playing a role, but maybe it's playing less a role than I originally thought. And I that's the message I try to portray in my classes is, I have unique perspective on strength adaptation, I think. You don't have to subscribe to that, but maybe you move around the hierarchy of how you think about strength, right? Because the evidence is not super clear. Um, so yeah, that's kind
Yeah.
of where I'm coming at it from.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get into that, right, it's the idea of like you have the authoritarian like phenomenon of like if you have someone in charge, if you have the lab coat on, you don't really question that person because they're the authority figure, right? And that's how a lot of the science gets predicated a lot of times. If they do the research and that person's really well known and they're really well respected, then what they say kind of gets continued to be pushed and pushed and pushed, kind of like the general adaptation syndrome that you talked about as well, right? Like that was a phenomenon that got pushed and it just kept getting pushed and pushed, and no one really questioned it. And I guess my question to you then would be like, what made you, have you always been a creative thinker to question, not so much to make it seem like you're questioning authority, but to look outside the box and think, maybe we're not doing this, it's justice, maybe we're not looking at it from all angles. Have you always been that way, or is that something you developed over the years? And if it is, how did you develop that? Because I think that's something that's lacking so much within not
Yeah.
only research but within coaching practices from an anecdotal standpoint as well.
Yeah, I that's a great question. And I've definitely not always been this way. In fact, I remember I was on the tail end of my master's degree, and I wanted to go into coaching because I honestly didn't think there was that many unique questions left to answer regarding skeletal muscle, strength, hypertrophy, all these sorts of things. I think really what did it for me was having good mentorship. Mentors who, when I would make a statement, right? So if I said, well, we need variation in the training program to maximize growth, right? My mentor would say, why do you say that? Right. And I'd say, well, everyone knows that. And he's like, yeah, but you're a scientist now. You need to tell me, why do you believe that? Why are you saying that? And it would force me to be able to back up everything I say. And when you're kind of forced to take that approach where you need to be able to have evidence, you start looking into, okay, why do I think this? And when you go down those rabbit holes, a lot of times you discover and realize that I think this because I've been told that, or because everyone does it this particular way, but I don't actually have a good reason as to why I subscribe to this. And sometimes that's okay, right? Like there's things that people do in the gym that are really effective and way ahead of the science. That happens a lot of the times. But I think what also happens is tradition kind of trumps logic, and
Yeah.
we perpetuate ideas and methodologies that don't necessarily need to exist. So I told the story in class, but um, I the muscle size and strength thing, like that's something I had never thought of, and it was just a conversation with my mentor. We were downtown in Mississippi at this little fair they were having, and we were walking back, and he said to me, he's like, I'm just beginning to think this muscle growth isn't doing too much. And I said, yeah, you're crazy, right? I wasn't on the same wavelength as he was at the time. And he's like, go find me the evidence. He would just always challenge me, right? To go find evidence for why I believe this. And just over time, kind of developing that inquiry of, okay, can I back, not that you can never back everything you say, but when you say something, you think about why do you say it.
Yeah.
And it took a long time. It took a long PhD to arrive at a place where the inquiry kind of naturally happens, right? And when you hear something new, you go, huh, I wonder if that's true. And there's something new every couple of weeks now, right? The newest paper is partial ranges of motion in muscle growth. We
Right.
read that one in our lab meeting. And so my immediate thought is, okay, why would doing the bottom range of motion be better than doing full range of motion? physiologically, what would be different about this? And we had a discussion in my lab the other day about that, because that's one of the newer studies. And nowadays, what I've noticed in our area, right, strength and hypertrophy, one study has a pretty large influence on people, right? So there's
Yeah.
people who this one study came out, and they're going to be trying to do different ranges of motion to affect adaptation. I'm not sold after one paper, right?
Right.
Um, but we see stuff like this, and it really makes you a skeptic, because science is messy, and it takes a robust sample size, a robust study design to really demonstrate something. And then once you demonstrate something, you need replication over and over again. And then you get closer and closer to the truth of how we adapt. But I think I rambled way past the question.
No,
But
no, I like that. You used the word that I was looking for, and that's skepticism, right? Like we're always as coaches, and I mean, Tony and I have been competitive athletes for a long time. He's since moved on to less competitive endeavors, but I think part of being a practitioner as well as you know a coach is being skeptical until you try it yourself and see what's going on. Like I won't ever program things for athletes that I've never done for myself and seen results from. That was something that I started when I first got into coaching. And I think what you said about, being a skeptic is about asking questions. And so if you read something that you think may hold some water, ask the questions around it. Like when Tony mentioned we were going to be interviewing you, I said, okay, well, I'm going to look up this guy and see what he's written so that I can ask him better questions.
yeah.
And lo and behold, I read your studies and I have a lot of questions. And that's not to say that I disagree with you in any way, but it's just to say that that's how maybe something we talk about today will spurn another question in your head, and that's the next study that you investigate, or however that goes. If you accept things as they're written off one study, the questioning stops, the investigation stops, the science stops,
Yeah.
and then nothing new happens.
Yeah, and people just will iterate the study and replicate it in a different population, and that stuff's not exciting,
No.
right?
Right.
But science, when it happens organically, and you want to just know why things happen, and it's a lot of fun. And I've never been short of questions. We have great students at USF, and they keep me busy. And we a lot of people always email me and they say, what studies are you guys doing in the next year? And I can never answer because I have no idea, right? We do a study and that leads to the next question.
Mhm.
And when we read a paper in a lab meeting and we go, I don't know if I'm buying that. And we design a study. And that's how science has turned out to work for me. And it's just it's cool. It's lines of inquiry and trying to get closer to truths constantly.
It's great too, because it gets past like the dogma of, just because this person is coined the king of hypertrophy through research, whenever that research gets put out there, it's taken and ran with by everyone, right? And like you said, no one really questions that authoritative figure because they've been known to be that person in the research, right? And I think the way you're doing it is you're creating a bunch of other researchers that are going to ask really good questions. Where by looking into PhD programs, I've come across several places where I was told, if you go to this place, you pretty much have to do exactly as they say. You can't question things. It's like, and they're usually the older guard of, this research type of endeavor. And it just seems very problematic, right? It just seems like you're going there to prove their research rather than question things and find the truth, or find other things that could be at play here, right? Because like you said, we don't know everything. And to pretend we do is just a farce.
Yeah, it's sometimes occasionally I'll hear a student say, I really want to prove this. And I say, hold on, take a step back. You don't need to prove anything. You need to search for the truth, and you study design to get closer to it. If you're ever trying to prove stuff with science, I think that's the wrong approach, because you've already revealed what you want the answer to be,
Right.
right? And the only thing you should want is to answer the question, right? And I think what you said, Tony, I think that's how people sometimes do approach it is, I know this is true, I'm going to prove it,
Yeah.
right? And maybe that works in different business and different endeavors, but I don't think it's the appropriate approach for science. Science, you should have a desire to answer questions, and if you think something is important, you should test that hypothesis and see if it is, but never be trying to prove it. And I was really lucky with my mentorship, um, and I've tried to be the same type of mentor where, like, getting challenged is a really good thing. And
Yeah.
and I think my mentor really valued not everybody agreeing. Disagreement is really, really healthy, because if you have a disagreement, you have a reason to do a study, right? And then after a study, maybe there's still some disagreement, but maybe you're a little bit closer in your thinking, because now, okay, we have this evidence, right? We have a little bit more piece of the puzzle. It doesn't completely answer the question, but it got us closer. And yeah, I think there's so much value in disagreement, and I think disagreement's healthy. I,
Mhm.
I think, there are times in science and I mean, in the world of social media and all this, things can get nasty, and they do sometimes. I try to never take anything personally, or ever make it about an individual or a group of people or this person or that person. If you focus on the data, it's just, okay, this is the data we have, and what can we do to improve the story that we're telling through study design and inquiry.
Yeah, and believe it or not, right? And a lot of people wouldn't think this, but in the military, it's the same way with good leadership, right? You want to question the tactics when you're going in there and you're developing your SOP for the mission. You want to make sure that you have enough people around you and you facilitated a good enough environment for them to ask questions and to challenge your authority. Because if you're going into places trying to prove yourself right all the time, you may miss a lot of deadly scenarios, right? Because you created such a tunnel vision to prove your point that you need those other people around you to continue to question and try to find holes in your logic and your scenarios, so that when you do go on missions, you come back alive because you figured out all those holes. And it's something that doesn't get thought about a lot within the military. They think it's very much do as the person in charge of you tells you to do. But with good leadership, I guess good leadership in general, right? Business, academia, military, you want people around you that are going to question you in a way that allows you to continue to grow and learn yourself, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a quality of a good leader, is open to criticism and open to discussion. And it's something that I think people who are in a leadership role constantly have to work on, and make
Mhm.
sure. Sometimes I have to check myself to make sure I don't close my mind to things. And sometimes too, I have to encourage my students to disagree with me. Like, please, if you don't think I'm right, say something. and,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's hard, because um I think, and I still struggle with this, and try to work on this. You want to be approachable, as a leader or in a position of authority. You want people being comfortable doing that, and it's not always the case. I think the
Yeah.
people I worked really closely with get to that level of comfort. Our first year, our first year master student, first semester, probably a little bit more hesitant,
Right.
because they are so new. But I think by the end of the program, most students are, comfortable saying, I'm not sure I believe this. And I think also, it's great to disagree, but disagreement alone isn't enough, right? So I think as a leader, when someone says, I disagree with that point you're making, I say, okay, what is that disagreement based on, right? So any position I take, I try to have a reason why I subscribe to that, right? And I can cite 5, 6 papers that support my point. And then, if I don't agree with it, I say, okay, what is that disagreement based on? And 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 what is that disagreement based Maybe someone disagrees and they provide a nice rationale, but there is no evidence. So it's okay, we can disagree. You might be right. I think I'm right. My point has more evidence than yours, right? So that disagreement can exist. One point might be more correct, but not everything is written in stone. And in 10 years, maybe the person who doesn't have the evidence is actually correct.
Yeah.
So I think the discussions are healthy. You're not always going to be right in your disagreement, but you should have the opportunity to disagree and make your point, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, it does, because if done correctly, both parties learn tremendously from it, and that's what you want to leave any discussion or disagreement with. So, Paul, do you have anything you want to start off with as far as going over Dr. Buckner's research and things?
Yeah.
I know we want to focus on a lot of the hypertrophy and strength stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of just went like, I went on Google Scholar and I just read everything he wrote. Just kind of pulled out a few sentences that I kind of tweaked something for me, especially to go along with the conversations that Tony and I have been having the last number of weeks. And we've been talking quite a bit about specificity and strength and how important that is as a driver. Anecdotally, I've been competing in the same 2 weight classes, and Tony as well, and looking at, okay, how much change in my total has gone on with my body weight remaining relatively the same, but me now having a completely different body composition than I had before, obviously carrying more muscle mass. And the answer is, in the last 4 years, my total hasn't done anything, and I'm substantially more muscular. So it begs the question, like, is that additional hypertrophy genuinely leading to better 1 max performances? And the sentence I pulled out was, we suggest that the 1 max is a specific skill which will improve most when training incorporates its practice, or when a lift is completed at near maximal loads. So that's essentially stating that maximal strength is a specific skill set and not fully encompassing improvements that might be seen within an intervention. So basically, if you're not training for a specific movement, and that movement is the given test of strength, because keeping in mind strength is specific, right? So if our measure of strength is the squat or the bench press or the deadlift, in order to best prepare someone for a maximal bench press, squat, or deadlift, we need to be squatting, benching, or deadlifting, which is intuitive, right? Yeah. But there are many different periodization models or periodization schemes that people throw around, where they just don't touch those movements for extended periods of time and throw specificity out the window. They might still be lifting maximal loads from a subjective standpoint, but from an absolute standpoint of intensity, the loads don't match up. And then it looked at, there was a mention of low load training versus high load training. And there's better hypertrophy seen with low load, but not as good strength improvements. But when tested in the new movement, changes in strength were not as different. So if you were lifting for hypertrophy with a squat movement, or training for strength with a non-squatting lower body movement, the differences in strength, even though you're using lighter loads but a specific lift, were very similar to using a different lift but heavier loads, which I thought was pretty interesting, because then we look at the drawbacks to low load training as it pertains to hypertrophy, which we know is high fatigue levels. But looking at how can we incorporate variation in our training, either in off season or to alleviate certain orthopedic issues that we run into, how does that interplay exist? And this plays into the greater question, or the greater goal that Tony and I have with this podcast and our platform is, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of interplaying variables. And just this single sentence that I said earlier has like far-reaching implications when looking at everything. Yeah. So could you maybe tease out a little bit of, if we're looking at low load, high specificity, or high load, lower specificity, what that kind of looks like?
Yeah, so I like this conversation, and I will start by saying science cannot perfectly answer,
Oh, of course, yeah.
this question, and it's one I've thought about quite a bit. And I guess where this started for me is at Ole Miss, we did a lot of low load training, and at USF we do some low load training. Sometimes we use blood flow restriction, BFR. And what we would notice oftentimes, sometimes strength would increase, but it was less consistent of an increase in strength. And a lot of it depended on the complexity of the movement. So if you're doing low load training with 30% of your 1RM, it's typically going to increase your strength, but it won't increase your strength as much as lifting heavy through that same movement. So low loads for strength are not as good at increasing maximal strength as just plain lifting heavy. But you do get practice on a movement. So I guess the first aspect is, okay, you need to deload, or you need to back off how much weight you're lifting. Is low load or switching up the exercise the right path of going about your programming? And I almost think my suggestion might be lift heavy with really low volume, or lift moderately heavy with low volume, and maybe manipulate it that way instead. Just do really low volume training, touching some moderately heavy weights, and varying the exercise is an interesting idea. So if this is a question of, does making a muscle stronger through an unrelated movement or even a somewhat related movement, does that strength transfer to the movement you care about, right?
Mhm.
So if you increase the strength of the muscles that help you squat, right, through, let's say you use machines or use some dumbbell variations, it's not a squat. I would argue, and this is based on not great evidence yet, but you might have a small transfer of that strength. But I think the best case would be a maintenance of strength
Mhm.
when you step away from actually performing that lift, if that's even achievable. What we have in the literature is, when you train the bicep, a lot of the experimental models are simple movements. They're knee extension, measured different ways, or they're bicep curl models with strength measured different ways. So in the literature, we'll measure strength isometrically, which means you'll pull at 90 degrees on a handle. Just pull as hard as you can. And if you train isotonically, which is through a full range of motion, strength will increase, let's just say 20% isotonically. So training isotonically, strength will increase 20% training isotonically. If you instead trained isometrically, right, just trained holding here, and then again tested strength isometrically, maybe strength increases 5% instead of 20, right? Whereas if you tested strength isometric strength has increased 20%. So some of that strength transfers, but not all of that strength transfers, if that makes sense. So the closer you are to the movement, the more that strength is going to transfer to what you actually care about. And I don't know that I could say which one would be better, doing heavy weight on different exercises or doing lightweight on the same exercise. I would tend to lean towards the same movement is going to be better.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a specific study I could point to that would definitively show that or demonstrate that, but you're practicing the movement, and if the movement has some skill component, you're maintaining that pattern. But you brought up something, which is kind of the wear and tear, right? Maybe you just that chronic movement is to the point where it's causing issue. So maybe there are periods of time where you need to step away from a movement. And in those instances, I think you have to accept the fact that you're probably not going to progress your strength in that movement until you can go back to that movement.
What jumped out at me as the question here is the absolute load the most important factor? or is it the relative intensity? Meaning, say I go from a barbell squat, that's our tested lift, okay? A barbell squat, 100% of my barbell squat is, we'll say, 500 pounds.
Mhm.
I'm still gonna, I change the barbell, or I change the implement I'm using, and my maximal effort single is 400 pounds. But I'm still putting maximal force into that barbell. I've just offloaded 100 pounds.
Mhm.
Would that relative 100% transfer to the absolute 100% if the modalities are somewhat similar?
Okay. So when you said you changed the implement,
So
what
it
was?
changed like from a barbell to a safety bar.
Okay.
So a
Okay.
safety bar would pitch the lifter forward a little bit more, makes things upright a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Typically correlates about 85% of one rep max.
More similar.
Mhm.
So there's I think the likelihood of if there is strength adaptation from if you do increase strength on that movement, some of that might transfer, but it's a tricky thing because okay, when you perform one movement a lot and you switch to another movement, right? And so an easy example is when you're doing flat bench press and you go to incline, your incline isn't as strong as if you always practice incline,
Right.
right? So your flat is here, your incline's currently here, its potential. You start training incline, you bring incline up to here. Well, all you did was maximize your incline strength. That strength increase was that movement, right? I don't think you've done anything for your flat bench strength. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's the argument for like dynamic correspondence, because you likely if you matched your best bench on the incline, you probably improved your bench press somewhat. But
Mhm.
what I'm understanding from what you're saying and what the research says is by increasing my incline, I may have increased my bench press, but likely not as much as I would have had I just continued to bench press.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
I mean, and we've seen that, right? We've seen lifters improve their lifts due to variations and it not have any type of carryover to their main
Oh
lifts
God,
as
yeah.
well, right?
Yeah.
So that it's kind of the idea of like taking the guesswork out of your lifting program, simplifying it as much as possible. And one of the biggest kickbacks I always get is what you talked about, Dr. Buckner, was the idea of like this wear and tear component due to the specificity of movement. And I always think of it in terms of what movement selection that you would choose outside of a squat that would create less wear and tear, but still work the same muscles, right? Like I've talked to Dave Tate, who had to get hip surgery, and his hips were bothering him. So he started doing all this mobility work and all this extra work to try to get as flexible as possible. And his doctor told him by doing all that stuff, it took probably 2 or 3 years off of his lifting that he could have been doing if he just would have squatted, right? So if we take a barbell off our back to diminish the wear and tear and we start doing walking lunges or leg presses, I don't understand how that's going to be any different in terms of wear and tear prevention, right? Because you're still having knee flexion, you're still having hip flexion. It's just not axial loading. So it just doesn't make sense to me that that would be a productive way of doing things. That's just variation for the sake of variation more so than a complete, like if you didn't want wear and tear, then you would never bend your knees or flex your hips or anything like that. That would be the only component of non wear and tear.
Sign me up for that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I honestly think a lot of it is people just doing too much, honestly.
Yeah.
We're often sold a bag of goods that we need, that volume is always going to be better for us and putting us in a place to win. And I just don't think, I think there's limited truth to that, especially for strength.
Yeah.
Um, but if people are prioritizing hypertrophy work in their strength programs, right, there's a trade-off there, right? That volume associated with that hypertrophy, maybe that is why you feel like
Yeah.
you need a break, not because you're a strength athlete working on movements and skills. So I think the volume associated with all of the hypertrophy additional training I think that's probably where I would pull back, and where you can save yourself a lot of that stress, if you are experiencing these things.
Right. Like that's something, the exercise selections, right? And what you're trying to, what adaptation you're trying to create with those exercise selections is the most important thing when it comes to injury prevention or anything along those lines. Like for me, when I work with athletes, I'm thinking, how can I get them as strong as possible and keep them injury free? And like what you just said, the biggest driver of injury is going to be, in my mind, fatigue and volume accumulation. So if I can take their accessories and make them more specific to improving stability or improving ranges of motion, or and just making them feel better when they leave the gym instead of running them into the ground, then we can push their specificity work more, as opposed to thinking that if I run them into the ground with their accessories to drive hypertrophy, then because we're getting bigger muscles, they'll get stronger over time. And that's just something that I haven't seen myself. I went from when I first started powerlifting in at like 235 pounds, I had like a 1580 total, and I finished competing at 242, and I had a 2006 pound total without really much additional work to added hypertrophy, right? There maybe 10 extra pounds, but
Yeah,
I wasn't
yeah.
able, I never got hurt. And because of that, I was able to train specifically for a long time. And I think that just by changing that mindset of like hypertrophy drives strength over time and focusing on injury prevention and specificity of movements, that's going to take them a lot further.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, a lot of that mentality is um hard to fight, I suppose. And I tell you guys all the time, you can have your insurance policy, but just decrease its importance within the program. And maybe like someone thinks hypertrophy is important. Okay, go do 2 sets on a machine, right? It's it may be the volume in the complex movement maybe isn't always going to be smart. So do a little bit of hypertrophy. I think people are always going to want to grow their muscles.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, you both have been powerlifting for how many years?
Over a
Probably,
decade.
Yeah, over a
yeah.
decade.
So how much growth is left in the tank?
Right.
So the volume you need to maintain what you have is quite low. And a lot of the data would suggest your strength routines are those alone are going to maintain a lot of it. So um, I think once you are, you know, once you've grown your muscles, and most people who train have powered for any given period of time, they've probably grown their muscles close to um, maybe not their full potential, because they could increase volume, frequency, or something, and it's probably squeeze out a little bit more. But um, we train, and it's a byproduct. Our muscles are going to grow, and at that point, maintain and focus on what you care about, your goal, which is maximizing your strength.
Yeah. So the question would be then, if that's the goal, right? And if specificity seems to be one of the biggest drivers, right? That neural connection, that neural drive, what would what would a program look like, right? Because when you talk about specificity, people automatically think, oh, so you're just doing a 1 rep max every time you go into the gym and there's no volume. And so I don't know what exactly that would look like, right? In your
Mhm.
mind, if you're putting together a program for a strength athlete, that we're starting to focus more on specificity, less on hypertrophy. Well, what exactly does that look like? Because that's so far from the norm of what a person is told to do, that they're just absolutely lost, and they'll go into the gym and they'll max out every single day they get there.
Yeah. So the maxing out part of it was more of a scientific proof of concept, right? So this is where we get, I think, misunderstood, and people misinterpret science to be like they're studying what training program we should be doing, right?
Mhm.
So we showed, so I think maybe 4 or 5 times now we've demonstrated that just doing a 1RM gets you as strong as doing a lot of volume with relatively heavy weight. So there's no difference there. So And we also have found, and this is more from reviewing uh, all of the literature, that the more complex a movement, the more important it is to lift heavy. So it doesn't mean you do a 1RM every time you train, right? You could do singles, doubles, triples, you could do sets of 4, even 5. Still, it's less volume than repping out 15, 20 reps, 12 reps in that hypertrophy range. But maybe you have a heavy day and a moderate day,
Mhm.
right? And you know, you want to track recovery, and you want to. I suppose you need to decide how many times do you want to train that movement a week, and then maybe make one more of a moderate day and one a heavy day, but a low volume day. And it's just prioritizing strength, but then making sure you're not overtraining and pushing it too hard. And that's the tempting thing, I think, for most people who train, is accepting that, okay, I'm going to do a fairly low volume training program here. So maybe it's a few triples or doubles, right? And it could be a doubles where you could do 3 or 4, but it's still relatively heavyweight. Um, and yeah, I think just a overall low volume, lifting heavy when appropriate approach um, is what I would suspect would be the most optimal. Now, the closest thing to studying in a powerlifting population has come from James Steele's research group, and they've done a few studies that replicated on some level what we did, and they found, not surprisingly, that doing just 1RMs periodically worked for some of their population, right? But it didn't work for all of their population in the study. So I think that just goes to show you that you don't want to translate that directly to your training. But I think what it does say is, evaluate how much time are you spending in the gym, how many sets are you doing in your training, and how much that can we maybe get rid of, or we reallocate our time towards, instead of doing these accessory movements, instead of doing this volume after I lift heavy, right, for hypertrophy, dedicate some time to some recovery, some injury prevention, and those sorts of things. I think that approach would be perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
This conversation brings up a very important point, in that research is meant to be descriptive and not prescriptive,
Yeah.
right? Just because some methodology, this like robust study that was done, proved that X intervention had X results and it was super favorable, doesn't mean everyone should go out and do that. It should be, okay, this describes a phenomenon that we've demonstrated. How can you apply it? And then within your training paradigm, you make the appropriate changes, as you mentioned, looking at your volume, looking at your intensities and saying, is this the appropriate frequency? Is this the appropriate amount of work? Can I pare this down to a point where my recovery is maximized? And maybe that lets me train more often, right? If you're the one thing that I really loved about like this study was the athletes got just as strong, lifting way less volume. So if I can go in and do a couple moderate singles, a few heavy triples, maybe training twice a week, versus going in and training sub-maximally and doing 40 working reps within a training session, and I get just as strong, well, I'm definitely opting for option A.
Yeah. And I think maybe the most optimal program is going to combine maybe a few exercises that are doing heavy eccentric overload for the injury prevention aspect, in combination with low volume, heavy training. Like, and again, so your audience knows I'm not a power lifter. I'm a researcher who studies strength, but I think what the data would suggest is lifting something heavy and focusing muscles that tend to be injured in that sport, right? And the best, Tony knows some of the literature, but the Nordic hamstring exercise reduced hamstring injuries like crazy in athletes, right? And it's a partner exercise that seems to be really effective, and it's because it has that heavy eccentric overload which seems to provide benefits, protecting against injury. So I think having an injury prevention program in combination with a low volume strength program, and then, when someone's new to lifting, they obviously need a lot of practice and a movement to get proficient at it.
Right.
So I think we're talking when someone's trying to continue to increase their strength, but obviously when you're starting out, you need a certain amount of volume of practice to become good at something. So I suppose we need to keep that in mind as well. But I think you can accomplish this with pretty low volume.
Yeah, and one of the great things too about the injury prevention stuff that we looked at in class and just through the literature is there's no real need to have an increase in volume through injury prevention, right? Like they were able to, if you do 2 sets of 10 on the Nordic curls and that's keeping you healthy, there's no reason to go to 3 or 4 or 5 sets because it doesn't have a linear effect in your improvement of injury recovery. So you find these exercises that are kind of gatekeepers that you keep in your program that keep you healthy. Maybe they're like something for your shoulder, something for your hip, something for your knee, something for things that often get injured on you. And you keep those in at a set volume rate, and then you do everything else to push and drive adaptation in your competition lifts. That just makes the absolute most sense to me. And when you deal with I call powerlifters, they're not real athletes. And I don't know how you feel about that, Professor, but when you deal with like real athletes, that's pretty much the same goal. Is like, I just want them to be as healthy as possible leaving my facility. I don't want them ran into the ground because their sport's going to do that in and of itself. And it should be the same concept, right? Our sport is singles. That should be the thing that we run into the ground. And then everything else should be preventative so that we're able to continue to push those singles. And then there's also research on perception, right? Like your perceived effort. If you can leave the gym feeling better than when you came into it because you did a bunch of work that helped you feel good and that you have more parasympathetic drive at the end of a workout, your ability and your drive and motivation to want to come back in the next day is going to be higher than it was before. So maybe you're able to extend your training blocks even further. Maybe you're able to diminish fatigue a little bit more so that you're able to train more often, right? Instead of doing these programs where it's like last set of 100 leg extensions, run ourselves into the ground. It's like, you don't want to go back to the gym the next day because you can barely walk.
Yeah, you won't be able to go back to the gym the next day.
Right?
I think I like what you said. And then I'm cool calling it a sport.
Well, you're the only one on this podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm the one that doesn't do it. So
Dr. Buckner, we're literally not allowed to move our feet. Like we get penalized if we move our feet.
That's a good point. But like, if you compare it to any other sport or activity, when you go to basketball practice, you play basketball, right? You practice what you need to be good at. So I think sometimes because it is lifting weights, we think that any lifting of any weights is training for what we care about.
Right.
And I think the mentality that this is our sport or our activity, right? We're powerlifters. We're going to train for powerlifting, right? Which means you're not going to come in and do a circuit on unrelated movements. You're there to train powerlifting. And then, athletes go to strength and conditioning coaches for supplemental activities, right? So you supplement actually care about with other activities that are thought to increase strength of some of the musculature, maybe bring up some weaknesses, focus on injury prevention. So you want to make sure, like, if you have periods of time where you're not practicing your sport, then maybe you need to reevaluate your training.
Yep.
I definitely think that is a good way to think about it, because if you compare it to other competitive activities, you never go to basketball practice and play baseball.
Right. Or you don't show up to basketball practice and you're like, man, I'm so naggered from all the weight training that I'm doing that I can't play basketball today. Your coach is gonna be like, well, then you're not weight training anymore because basketball is the main driver, right?
Yeah.
So something that I would want to get your opinion on is if we we have these mechanisms that drive strength, right? But we don't know them all. And you recommend that hypertrophy is not as big of a driver as strength as people tend to think it is, that maybe neural drive is going to be the biggest. So what other adaptations do you think is going on within the body? And how do you do research to kind of showcase that? Because we talked about that a little bit in class, like maybe something's going on with calcium, maybe something's going on with the myosin and actin, maybe like what exactly do you think is going on that's driving these strength adaptations if it's not hypertrophy like so many people think?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I tend to think it's mostly a neural adaptation, which could mean it's occurring anywhere from the brain, the spinal cord, the alpha motor neuron, the neuromuscular junction, the transmission down the muscle fiber, the release of calcium, the binding of calcium. Um, and I that's why I love telling the story of skeletal muscle physiology, because when you see how complex it is, right? And when you realize that adaptations happen along every part of this, then it's not as extreme to suggest that, you know, maybe we say that in this study it doesn't seem like it did anything. In this study it doesn't seem like it did anything. But even if we say it's still contributing, right? Which a lot of people think it does. I think it's really fair to say it's contributing, but it's much less. So I think a lot of it's motor unit recruitment and synchronization, those sorts of things. I think there could be adaptations of them at the muscle level, independent of growth. So that would be our calcium kinetics and just the overall interaction of actin and myosin. Um, I hope we get closer to the answer in the coming years, and I think people are becoming more interested in it overall. Um, but I think just the mere fact of adding sarcomeres, those sarcomeres then have to act in coordination with the other aspects of the muscle to enhance strength. And what's interesting in study design is it's so difficult to show that that's true,
Yeah.
right? That's why we started to be open to the possibility that it's either not doing anything or it's doing so little that we're not able to capture it, right? And I think we reached the point as a research team, to make the suggestion that it's not playing a large role. But recently, the most recent paper that our lab published, we tried to look at strength potential. So we had two groups. One group trained for strength for was it 8 weeks? The other group trained for hypertrophy for 8 weeks. And then the 4 weeks after that, both groups just did a 1RM for 4 weeks, 1RM twice a week. It's a bicep curl model, so there's some limitation there. So we wanted to see, does acquiring new tissue over 8 weeks enhance your strength in the following 4 weeks? So
Mhm.
it's almost like hypertrophy block before switching to strength, but one group did just strength the entire time. And the group that had growth did not have greater strength at the end of the study. So this is obviously kind of a starting point. You know, I think our lab is going to try for the next several years to try to make growth make someone stronger, right? So we're kind of looked at as the people who don't think it's causing strength. But I'm going to try to show it because, if I can demonstrate that it does, then I'll have a good reason to challenge my own thinking,
Right.
right? But until I can demonstrate it, I think it's hard for me to take the position that it's having a real meaningful change. Um, so I do think it's mostly a neural adaptation and perhaps local adaptation of the muscle independent of a change in size. I think it's possible that it contributes,
Mhm.
but I just find it really interesting that it's that hard to show it. And people have started to say, because they're frustrated with our suggestion, right? People have started to say, well, it's just too hard to show. I think scientifically that's a cop out, right?
It's a horrible answer. Yeah.
Horrible
And
answer.
and think about, both of y'all have education in this. Your textbook says everything beyond 8 weeks, strength wise, is attributed to growth, right?
Right.
So why can't we show it? I definitely think if it's even close to as important as people think it is, then there's a lab out there that can demonstrate it, right?
Should be.
And
Yeah.
and what's happened a lot is labs have relied on math, right? A correlation. So you lift heavy weight. When you lift heavy weight, you get stronger, strength goes up, you get bigger, size goes up. If two things move in the same direction, there's going to be a correlation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to vary in magnitude, but there's been this obsession over the correlation. And I keep seeing new papers come out where they will have a stronger correlation, which means more variance in strength is explained by the change in muscle size. But that just means you've manipulated growth such that you had less growth, and I think that would actually strengthen the relationship, because strength changes a lot more than muscle size does. But it's interesting to me because our criticism of that is, well, I could design a study to make you grow a lot and not get stronger at all.
Right.
So how do you explain that one? Or I could design a study to make you get stronger as a trained individual without growing.
Mhm.
And that doesn't fit the current model, which suggests that a trained person gets stronger because they grow, right?
Where I find this all gets like confounded is when looking at complex movements, right? If you're looking at a bicep curl, it's just a hinge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at a movement like a squat or a deadlift or a bench press, there's multiple joints, multiple muscles.
Yeah.
And I've always felt that hypertrophy, while it might not lead to like individual muscular strength, the accumulation of tissue would have you would have improved leverages for one. You'd have improved stability within the movement. It could potentially impact your ability to output force.
Yeah.
But trying to tease that out with regards to, well, if we gain muscular size, but our body weight also went up 40 pounds,
Yeah.
how do you tease out, what was it, the fact that you put on tissue, like muscle tissue, or is the fact that you gained 40 pounds of body weight and, dropped 2 inches of range of motion from your chest?
Yeah. That's why I think the mechanistic question is going to be answered in a simple model.
Right.
That's again the discussion of, people also get frustrated because it's a bicep curl and not a squat, not a deadlift, not a bench press.
Yeah.
But that's because we have the least things that could impact this movement, right? And we have a lot of control over it. And we know that people aren't walking on their hands, so they're leaving the bicep alone during our study period for the most part.
That's a good point. I never thought about it like that, actually.
So from the standpoint of science, it's a simple model where we have really good reliability in our measurements. So that means if a small change occurs, we're pretty good at measuring that change. I am fascinated by more complex movements. And even in our paper, we speculated that, we tested this in a bicep curl. Maybe it's different in a more complex movement. But I think for the time being, until we better understand it in the simple model, I don't think we're going to see a lot of labs moving to this more complex model, because, like you said, there are other perhaps advantages to increasing how much tissue you carry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if that's true, then there's the trade-off of, okay, does the benefit of decreasing my range of motion, is that worth the amount of weight I increased, right? Am I still in the same weight class? And is that tissue worth the trade-off there?
Actually, I saw it the other way, actually. So when I when I started improving my body composition, I didn't have a gut anymore. So I had to change the way I performed the lifts because I actually got weaker.
Ah,
Because I put
okay.
on all this size in my upper body, my belt went down 4 belt loops. So my
Yeah,
midsection wasn't as strong. I didn't have a belly to push into my quads when I was squatting. So I
yeah,
literally had to change the way I lifted. So this is a really complex question to answer.
yeah,
And looking at, is it a function of improved leverages? It is a function of hypertrophy. Likely not, but maybe hypertrophy within multiple muscle groups. Like, how would you even measure that if you were to measure like a hypertrophy model within a complex pattern? Which muscle do you pick?
yeah,
So is like, I've also thought back on the question of like duration. Maybe the adaptation to muscular hypertrophy, maybe it just takes more time. Maybe like,
yeah, yeah. So I've heard this as well, and it's possible, right? Um, it's possible that I've heard the suggestion that there's delayed strength. So I forget what the terminology they use for it. The transmutation takes well,
transmutation.
that's a new
It's a
emerging
science
word.
word. Yeah.
Well, it's in the strength and conditioning stuff, and I've that word's it pops up more and more. Um, but yeah, I've heard the suggestion that, and it's only come up since we questioned this paradigm, the suggestion that okay, that tissue now is going to take time to develop a neural network so it can contribute to
Mhm.
strength. I don't know that there's truth to that. I think um, to answer that question, we just need longer studies,
Right.
right? Um, I still don't think that's the case, but it's certainly possible that maybe we need time with that tissue for it to be able to contribute to strength. It's definitely a possibility, and one that I've thought about. So the question then becomes, how long does a study need to be, to demonstrate the importance of this muscle tissue? So I would still say that you could be right, and I think science can answer that question by slowly, okay, let's try 8 weeks hypertrophy followed by 8 weeks strength compared to just 16 weeks of strength. So now we've increased that duration of strength to 8 weeks. If
Mhm.
that doesn't work, let's increase it to 10 weeks. If that doesn't, like, let's keep increasing it, because I think this question is important enough that we should continue to use study design to try to demonstrate it, right? And that's kind of been what a lot of labs and what a lot of scientists and scientific communicators slash influencers, they will just simply write off our findings by saying that, but then they don't want to study, right? So there's
Right.
a lot of people that they believe it so strongly that they don't think there's any reason to collect the data. Um, and I understand that it's so intuitive that a larger muscle is going to be a stronger. It's incredibly intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
It was for me, but I still maintain that we should be, as a scientific community, we should be able to demonstrate this. So when I hear that these studies don't need to be done, this is already known, it's just really hard to show it. I don't. It's just not an acceptable answer for me.
Lazy. It's lazy.
It's lazy, and it's I know there is a group of people that just they're not interested in the question because they don't think the question should have ever been asked.
Mm.
And unfortunately, and now it has. And like I said, we could be wrong, and muscle growth could be important, right? And I always say that, like, I don't think it's a mechanism. It could be playing some role, but even if I am wrong, I'm not completely wrong, right? Even if I am wrong and muscle growth is not a mechanism for strength, we've still gotten more right than we used to be, because people at the very least are acknowledging that muscle growth doesn't seem to be the primary reason we're getting stronger, right?
Right.
So I think
Mhm.
even if it's not playing, like, so the two positions are, it's not a mechanism, it is a mechanism. Well, the answer, or maybe the answer is in the middle, right? It's a mechanism, but it's a really weak one, because adding whatever percent of tissue marginally impacts strength, but a lot of times it's overshadowed by all of these other mechanisms.
Mhm.
I think that could be where the truth lies, perhaps.
Yeah, and then just even anecdotally, like just from the 10 years of being in the sport, I've never seen anyone put on a ton of muscle and improve their total. It's more or less they're staying within the same weight class throughout 8 of 10 years of lifting, and they've improved their total just with time and not getting injured, right? And
Yeah.
that's just pure anecdotal, seeing the best lifters in the world lift. I've
And
even
if
seen
they
them go down in weight classes and get stronger and probably lose a little bit of muscle, right? So
if
like,
they yeah, if they did put on tissue, it was to go up a weight class. And then that was why they got stronger.
right. And then out of that, right, how much muscle can they actually put on? They may have added 20 pounds to their frame, but maybe only 5 of that. And that's both compete in, myself and Paul compete in non-drug tested federations, and you have drug tested federations, and you see a wide plethora of people that are really, really big that aren't that strong. And then you see a lot of people who aren't that big and are really, really strong. Right. And it just comes down to a lot of just time, and obviously like maybe how their genetics and all that stuff plays an important role. But I just never seen it play out where people are like, I focusing on this hypertrophy block and I'm going to put on all this muscle, and then all of a sudden their total goes up 200 pounds. You've just never seen it.
I think a lot, some of the confusion, or maybe some of the disagreement, comes from unrealistic expectations on how much you can grow, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I've heard people say I've put on 100 pounds of lean tissue. As a full grown adult, for one, I doubt it, right? Because I think we look back at our pictures of ourselves when we were still kids, right? We were still not kids, but developing. So I think sometimes we blur that line, like, flashback, whatever. I used to be 110 pounds, right? But I was halfway through puberty. I think we confuse development with exercise induced increases in muscle size. But once you're a fully developed adult, right, some people have an incredible ability to respond and grow their muscles, but the average response is somewhat unremarkable. And you're not stepping on stage and looking like, any type of Olympian. Natural bodybuilding is the best responders of muscle growth without drugs.
Right.
Don't they weigh like 180 pounds or something like that?
If they're
Natural
lucky.
bodybuilders, that would be a heavy one.
That would be a heavy one. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cute.
It's before they cut down. So I also think a lot of our critics, maybe they have put on 80 pounds of lean tissue, but they've done that with drugs, right?
Right.
So now you have this delusion that, how could this not be why I'm stronger? Well, the drugs change the discussion a little bit,
A lot.
but I think that the drugs also, they don't just affect the tissue, they affect the nervous system.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And strength is still disproportional to the amount that the muscles have grown. So yeah, it's a loaded topic, and I'm optimistic that we're going to continue to refine our understanding and be in a better place. But the traditional neural adaptations, the quote newbie gains, the first few weeks of training followed by hypertrophy is the primary mechanism. It's not that simple
Right.
for strength adaptation. And the evidence is everywhere. The training detraining literature. If you train somebody, they get bigger and stronger. If you detrain them, they lose their muscle, but they can maintain their strength if they just practice their strength periodically. There's so many lines of evidence that would support that. Again, at the very least, it's not a powerful mechanism, and there's other more powerful mechanisms for that adaptation.
Yeah, no, I agree. Anything else you want to end with, Paul?
I do. I want to be mindful of your time. So if you don't have time to answer this question, it was just one that sparked me. So I think this was more of a position paper than anything. was talking about frequency. So training frequency, you made the recommendation that you feel trained individuals should train similar muscle groups more frequently while reducing the total number of sets per session. So that was based on the fact that increasing the number of sets beyond some threshold had negligible effects on muscle protein synthesis. And then the duration of time period when muscle protein synthesis is elevated in trained individuals is a little bit shorter. So my question would be, is frequency going to be the main driver, or is it the total volume of meaningful work performed within the week? So we'll take 10 total sets between 2 days versus, so 5 sets each day versus 5 days with 2 sets each.
Okay.
So what would be, like, how can we take something meaningful away from that? Because when I read that, I'm like, well, I'm just going to train my full body every single day.
Yeah. So I think we've learned a bit since we wrote that paper, and it was a really enticing hypothesis that so when you train, you elevate muscle protein synthesis, and when it comes back to down to baseline, you've recovered. In theory, you should train again to re-stimulate that. So to spend as much time in an anabolic state as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that was our hypothesis and what we speculated. I honestly think that I think there's been some data that's come out since then, and I don't necessarily think, like, for example, 3 times a week is better than 2 times a week. I think for a lagging body part, and this is probably more for someone that cares about hypertrophy than anything,
Mm-hmm.
I think that increased frequency might be able to squeeze out a little bit more growth. So if you're close to your potential, maybe a technique you can use to get maybe just a little bit more would be to up the frequency of your training. But regarding the question of 10 sets 1 day versus 2 sets 5 days, with that specific example, I'd definitely go with 2 sets 5 days, because the volume thing, if you think about it, so when you train, you want to maximize muscle protein synthesis, right? So if muscle protein synthesis is maximized, let's say after 3 sets for the muscles involved in whatever movement you're doing, what can you do beyond that maximal protein synthetic response? You can it's already maximized, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all of those other sets are just fatiguing you and delaying your recovery from that training bout. They're not enhancing the protein synthetic response. So what it comes down to, I think, is how many sets of exercise maximize muscle protein synthesis for that movement, right? Maximize your muscle's ability to grow. I tend to think it's around 2 to 4. Some simple movements, I think 1 to 2 sets gets you 80% there, and then that extra 3rd and 4th set get you probably full maximal stimulus. So in theory, once you're back down to baseline and fully recovered from that training session, you can train again and maximize protein synthesis again. And if diet's perfect and everything, if you're good at recovering, there's probably some people out there that can up their frequency and maybe expedite how quickly they're going to grow, if that makes sense. But does it make a huge difference overall? I don't think so, right? So if you're talking about the duration of a career, if you employed high frequency, maybe you're going to be a few percentage points bigger. But the person that didn't do that high frequency, they'll reach the same endpoint. They'll reach their potential. Maybe it's just not quite as quickly, right? But that's theoretical. I think the difference would be pretty small and hard to measure. I don't think it'd be meaningful.
Okay.
So I definitely think the volume should be spread out strategically.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I think about volume is, I suppose I don't think about volume, but I think about training a muscle, maximize the stimulus in that workout, recover, and training it again. And I think of it in maximum stimulus as opposed to volume, because the volume thing for me gets you away from thinking about what the training is doing. And maybe it's not how most people think about it, but when I explain to people, okay, all you're trying to do is fatigue this muscle to activate it so it grows, right? And if you guys want to hear the study that's frustrating me the most right now, because it's making the rounds, and is this rest period thing. So there's a study that came out that showed that 3 minutes rest was superior to, maybe it was 1 minute rest between sets. And the mechanism was because doing 3 sets allows you to complete more volume in your subsequent sets, right? It's one study. Maybe it's true, right? But I've seen like all these people I follow who have pretty high influence suggesting this. And we had a discussion in lab. I said, what do you guys think of 3 minutes rest between hypertrophy sets? Right? Because when you train a muscle, I think recovery, you want a little bit, but you don't want too much, because you produce metabolites. You take advantage of metabolites to help you fatigue your muscle, right? So the chasing of volume is something that's been perpetuated a little bit. It's been perpetuated in some aspects of science now and in the industry. And it takes the focus away from understanding how and why we adapt sometimes.
That to me begs the question of what's more important, tension and load or metabolites? Because if I'm taking 3 minutes rest, I may be able to put more load across those tissues, but I definitely won't have the same metabolite buildup. So that's the question that I would go from there.
So the way I would explain this is it's a trade-off, right? So
Yes.
For example, if you're lifting 70% of your 1RM and you're lifting that weight to failure, let's say you do 8 to 12 reps, it was mostly achieved through a mechanical contribution, right? And what did the weight do to stimulate the muscle to grow? It fatigued it, right? You activated the muscle, you turned on the fibers, and that activated signaling proteins within those fibers to tell those fibers to grow. So you got from the starting point here to the ending point here, and it took you 12 reps, right? If you lift 30% of 1RM, so it's now been demonstrated that lifting lightweight to failure causes similar growth as lifting the 70%.
Right.
So the 30% will still get you from point A to point B, right? But since the weight is so light, you have to do more reps to get from here to here. And instead of relying solely on mechanical, you have to do enough reps to create enough metabolites that the muscle starts fatiguing. And as it fatigues, you turn on the muscle that would usually be only turning on to lift the heavy weight, right? So through 30 reps, you lift the small muscle fibers, they fatigue out because of metabolites. And now you turn on the larger muscle fibers and you still activate all of them from A to B. And you relied a little bit more on metabolites than you did with lifting the heavy weight. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's just a trade-off. So blood flow restriction is a great example. Blood flow restriction, you inflate a cuff at the top of your arm, and when you train, that it's stuck here, right? So during your rest period, the blood can't leave the arm. You've trapped metabolites in the muscle. So when you start your second set, you're already fatigued. And what does that mean? That means instead of starting and trying to fatigue these muscle fibers at the beginning, they're already fatigued.
Right.
I would compare it to almost starting, let's say we're starting now 10 reps into the set, right? Because metabolites have remained there and we've stayed fatigued. So the reason the 3 minute rest suggestion frustrates me is because I think it's smart to take advantage of metabolites. And I think, I think the most effective reps are probably the ones more towards the end of the training bout or the training set. And I don't know, I 3 minutes, it probably works the same as a shorter rest period, but I wouldn't expect it to be superior because you can perform more volume. Now that study showed that, right? And I think we need replication of that study.
How did they measure volume? Like load times reps?
It's muscle cross section. Oh, volume. Volume was measured as I guess just the number of reps per set. So when they had longer rest periods, they were less fatigued, so they did more reps
What
per set.
what
Now,
was the training modality?
um, I haven't read this
Because
paper in a while.
that's gonna be a
I mean,
huge influence on volume, right? Because if it's like 70% of 3 sets of 10 squat, of course, the shorter rest period, you're gonna do less volume. But if it was more based on what you were talking about with the metabolite buildup, right? And it was geared more towards exploring that end of things, maybe the
yeah.
volume would be closer to being matched, right? And then it wouldn't matter when it, I mean, that's something you talk about too, right? People set up studies to prove their point rather than setting up studies to answer the right questions.
Well, yeah, and it does depend on how many reps did you sacrifice because of the short rest periods. And if you're only doing like 3 or 4 reps in your set, like if the weight's way too heavy, then yeah, there's a problem with the amount of rest, or maybe the weight's too heavy.
Right.
But I do think it's a little misleading because people do quote metabolic training all the time for growth,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't do metabolic training if you're doing really long rest periods.
Right.
Right. So if this study has too much influence, because I was making the rounds, another pretty popular person posted the paper, and then, you know, all these bodybuilders were reposting it. I'm like, oh man, this makes me sad because think about it. Over 4 sets, you're now resting for 9 minutes and you're training for growth. Like I get that the study, when people take it and run with it too quickly, or maybe remove it from the context of which it was utilized, it now becomes a negative thing when the study should be a positive thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because studies are very specific. In this exercise with this load,
Mm-hmm.
long rest periods were more effective. But how it gets communicated to the masses oftentimes is long rest is better than short rest,
Right.
period.
Right.
And that's when, like, it just, I hate seeing it, and I know it'll fix itself, right? But how many people right now are employing this because this one paper, right? And they don't want to lose out on gains because this paper showed it, and stuff like that. Like, I love what I do. I'm passionate about it, and I love getting good information out there, right? So when I see it, I'm like, I don't even know who to tell. Like, who do I tell?
Right.
But sometimes things just have to run their course, I think. And then people realize, I'm spending 50 minutes in the gym resting with as many exercises as I'm doing. Like, this is not reasonable.
Sounds like a powerlifter's workout.
Right. Because that's another thing to contemplate, right? Like if you have 90 minutes in the gym and you have short rest period versus long rest period, well, which one's going to give you more volume in those 90 minutes, right? And then that would change the complexity of the research in and of itself. But I think that's the problem, is there's so much context that needs to be given when
Yeah.
these studies come out that no one really does that. And we have limited, that's why podcasts are a lot more valuable, because you can provide context to things. But if you put up, the study and then you put 90 words to describe the study, you're not really getting the actual context out there to help define and give people creative thought process. You're pretty much just telling them this is the way you should do it instead of this is the way you should think about doing it.
Yeah. It's about getting people to think about what they're
Right.
doing and why they're doing it. And it's 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 hard to, you can't give a whole education on something in a brief moment. And you know people don't have time to study up on this, so they do have to rely on good communicators, which it's nice to have podcasts and these sort of tools so we can discuss things, and people can hear different perspectives, and not subscribe to one polarized idea, or
Yeah.
an exact methodology that is thought to be superior, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to get you back on to go over all the hypertrophy stuff because
Yeah, that was really great.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh
So,
yeah, I love that, and I obsess over it way too much. So I could
oh,
probably
perfect.
talk
You're in the
forever on
same
that
boat
one.
then. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, we'll be mindful of your time. You've already been on for 90 minutes. So we'll cut it here. Appreciate you coming on, Dr. Buckner. Excited to see what your lab continues to put out in the fall and in the spring, and continuing to push the envelope on asking better questions.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it, and I hope the audience enjoys the discussion.
Yeah, I think they will. It's definitely a great one.